Can I talk about breaking things more?
Please.
I love this idea of like, you can learn about a poem by trying to make the worst possible poem. In my experimental games class, I gave my students, I think one of my favorite assignments we ever did, which is how to break Mario. Can you break Mario by like flipping out the colors that he, his iconic red and blue look? Or what if you like render Mario as like a non-Italian person? Like, is that one way to break him? Or I don't know, subject him to some kind of BDSM torture? Is that going to break Mario? Like the students would come up with all these really inventive ways of trying to break Mario, but in trying to come up with strategies to break something, you reveal a whole array of dimensions of what that thing is that you simply couldn't see otherwise.
All right, Danny Snelson, welcome to Urgent Futures.
Thank you for having me, Jesse. I'm such a fan.
Well, likewise. And this has been a long time in the making. We're here today talking about The Little Database, your incredible new book. But before we get to that, I have a left field question for you.
Oh boy, right from the jump.
What video game are you playing right now?
It should come as no surprise to you. I'm playing Death Stranding 2 with every spare moment I have. I wrote an article about the first game and about things like Google searches, fetch quests, and contingent reading. So it's one of those things where, as you may know, my video games have increasingly become my area of study, which is one of these professional curses where you turn all of your passions into labor. And so when I'm delivering boxes in Death Stranding 2, I don't quite know if I'm playing a video game or if I'm doing research. And maybe that's a good opening comment.
That's a good sweet
for
spot.
our conversation. Yeah.
Well, let's dive in on that article. Because I think it does segue to a lot of what you're getting into. As it turns out, all of your research is of a piece. The Poetics of Search. Talk to me about the Poetics of Search and talk to me about the trajectory that you've taken conducting that research.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's a big question, but I'll try to answer it concretely. I became really interested in the idea of everyday digital practices. So taking these systems that are enormously complex, impossibly varied, subject to any number of specialized discourses, and trying to find like how to connect those complex systems to the everyday practices, to the little devices we all carry in our pockets, to the little things that are recording us around the room. And one of them, the most pervasive, is the search bar. And I've been thinking a lot about just how dramatically the search bar has both transformed our relationship to knowledge in general, how we access things, how we find things we don't know, but also I think has transformed our way of doing scholarship, that rather than having to hold all kinds of bibliographic data in my mind as a kind of erudite scholar, I can deploy these systems to enrich or transform the way that I look at things. And that those things are transformed by being indexed by these types of search engines. The poetics, to get to your question, is the art of producing meaning while one is using one of these systems. And I'm sure we'll get into this in conversation, but it's one of the things I feel like poetry and poetics can offer the world. So Poetics of Search tries to foreground the meaning-making capacities of these forms, which are, I think, usually studied in other forms of either through narrative lenses, through technological lenses, or through broader kinds of cultural studies. And I think here, poetry and poetics, which has always been the study of how meaning is produced in highly compressed linguistic forms, is really useful for trying to unpack some of these more mundane and prosaic features of everyday digital life that are, again, highly compressed technical systems at the same time.
And before we leave Death Stranding 2 behind, or rather, I guess it's sort of Death Stranding and Death Stranding 2, how is that process visualized and manifest in that game? Because that was a really rich part of that article.
Yeah, and I should say, for your listeners who maybe haven't encountered one of the most profoundly weird games that's been released in recent years by the notoriously bizarre Hideo Kojima kind of video game auteur, Death Stranding 2 is a game where you're connecting a kind of post-apocalyptic USA, this landmass, through a kind of quantum-haunted internet where you can then print things into the environment. what I found really interesting about it is the game flouts a lot of gaming conventions, and one convention that I think is very common as an annoyance, as one of the most disliked, disdained, reviled aspect of open world video games is the fetch quest. So it's like when you encounter some cabin in the woods in The Witcher 3, and that cabin has a person who sends you into some remote valley. It's going to take you 30 minutes just to walk over there, ride your horse over there to gather some random assortment of flowers or other goods so that you can move the story forward. And what Death Stranding does really brilliantly is it takes this odious aspect of most open world games and transforms it into the whole game itself. So the whole game is one long fetch quest where you're just going out and trying to find things and print those things into the environment. And I thought this was a really potent speculative metaphor for what we do every time we load a search bar, right? That you open up your search bar and you're out fetching something. You're looking for something. And what I found most interesting is that you're often trying to find something you don't know yet. And I think that's where longer histories of like bibliographic study or the library sciences are really useful for thinking about, again, these prosaic, mundane, everyday features of ordinary life.
Well, that perfectly segues us to the eponymous little database. So to get us started, what is the little database?
Okay. How much time do you have? Now, the little database, I think I usually try and define in two ways. So on one hand, I'm using the word little in homage to the Little magazine. So that's part of why the article is there. The little database as a kind of form that I see can be usefully thought through the history and formal features of the Little magazine. The little database, more concretely, I could say, are websites like text.com, a collection of plain text files from the turn of the millennium. I look at Eclipse, which is a collection of radical images of radical small press poetry magazines, mostly from the last 25 years. PennSound, a sprawling repository of MP3 files, and UbuWeb, which is a kind of catch-all for works of art, film, and literature in the lineage of the historical avant-gardes. So I'm trying to look at these websites, and the websites function a lot like little magazines. They periodically release new materials into these public domains on the open internet, as it were. So on one hand, the little magazine was helpful for me in trying to think about these websites where I've edited a lot of these sites. I've been working and thinking about them for years. I'm sure we'll get into that in more detail, so I won't belabor that point now. But on the other side of little, they're big websites. These are important websites that have like 30,000 MP3 files or 500 full books that are absolutely ordinary. But I think we don't have a really good way of thinking about that level of scale, this kind of intermediary scale that's at once too large for like a close reading of like a single poem or a single book, but are like way too small and way too idiosyncratic for significant semantic analysis or data analysis more generally. So the little here, I mean, like the little magazine, it's not necessarily like super small, but they're very like ordinary, right? Like, they're eminently computable. And I think the little here is also trying to think about the little devices we carry around in our pockets that all hold 10,000 photos that hold in my Speechify app. I've got like 200 books that I'm, occasionally listening to. And I wanted to try to develop a set of methods and tactics, a framework to try to understand how to make sense of these collections, which I find deeply meaningful, right? Like the photos of my father who passed away are on that device. And there's too many of them for me to understand all at once. But they're everywhere. So the little database, to get back to your question, for me is a useful heuristic for trying to think about questions of scale with ordinary media.
That brings up something that I found myself thinking when I was reading, which is I'm curious if you have in your mind, and you buy yourself the space for this to be a way of thinking rather than sort of, you have a quote, something to the effect of, it's not sort of meant to be taxonomically precise. It's more meant to be a vector or sort of, an orientation to a collection of data. But I found myself wondering, what would the min spec of a little database be? Does it come down to issues of curation? Does it come down to, there's when you cross 10,000 from 9,999 files to 10,000, boom, you're a little database. Like, how are you thinking about when something elevates from being what we might think of as like a personal archive or album or something like that, and at the, I guess, the far end, like when something becomes more like, Layon 5B, or like when something becomes a data set, what's the min spec? But then I guess also the other part of that question is like, where in your mind does it start to shift into no longer being a little database?
It's really funny, actually. When I gave a job talk about this book when I got hired here at UCLA, where we're sitting now. And one of my colleagues asked me, after I'd given this impassioned and very articulate paper form of the book, they said, well, I don't understand, like, this is neither little nor is it a database. The things you're talking about. And so I think like here's where like a lot of this project is rooted in what Jerome again and others have called the social text. And here again, I'll just by recourse to the Little magazine and why the Little magazine is helpful. In working with the history of Little magazines, like there are many magazines that have a single issue, right? Like a Little magazine can be a single issue. I digitized for Jacket 2 reissues a magazine that's so small. It's a tiny little one-page folded thing that gets delivered out. And that's a Little magazine, right? Like a single sheet of paper maybe can be a Little magazine. But they can also, extend into thousands of issues with tens of thousands of contributors, something that runs for a long time, like the Little Review, right? It's quite large. And so I think it has to do more with use. And a lot of this project is about experience and use and these materials in practice rather than in some idealized abstract form. So I'm resisting answering your question, right? That I think that it's contingent, and one of the concepts that I really worked through in this book is a question of contingency, which is to say that these things have meaning in specific socio-poetic moments that are conditional on a point of access and conditional on a milieu and a culture. So the little websites I'm looking at, could be more strictly little databases. They come out of the tradition of like shadow libraries or fugitive collections. To rhyme with the Fugitive magazine is an alternate name for the Little magazine. But I think that by looking at these public websites, it opens up ways of understanding meaningful connections to small collections we have everywhere. So I'm going to resist entirely that question. Like there are some like massive data sets that in some ways I think are little databases that are actually quite large. But again, our question of scale with digital materials is a moving target. Right? As we've seen, like what used to be huge, like I don't know, downloading 100 megabytes would take 30 minutes when I was coming up on the internet. Now we talk about like petaflops and these like massive compute centers that the tech oligarchs are building. And so like the question of scale is also, I think, a moving and contingent target.
Well, that tracks. It's like you're reframing the way that we're thinking about not only like issues of archiving, but also the artifacts themselves in relationship to the archive. There's almost, you're not advocating for the little database you're not arguing for its right to exist, but there is a way in which the internet demands everything scale. I mean, neoliberalism demands everything scale. And so there's this aspirational quality of an orientation to our media and to the ways that we share that media and to the way that we interact with it in digital formats that maybe is already happening in many cases. But I think that the general person's relationship to those things can start to change with the reframe of the little database in their mind.
Yeah, and I think one other dimension of the little in the little database was when I started working on this as a doctoral project at the University of Pennsylvania. There was something that we used to call big data. It feels like very quaint to say that now, and especially as we have large language models and these other massive forms of computation. But big data was sort of sold through digital humanities programs, very much as a branding initiative, as a kind of way that analytical approaches using algorithms, visualization tools, other digital techniques would somehow reveal things that we didn't already know about literature, right? So parsing, say, 10,000 Romantic era novels for semantic flows based on gender, right? Like that, there's a, I'm not going to get deep into it. And I do have, I think, some very real critiques of that approach to literature. But I wanted to actively think about a form that could push against currents of bigness, largeness, and the kind of empirical promises that those approaches to literary and cultural forms tend to make. I come from a background where language is slippery. Poetry is defined by its negative capabilities, as Keats said, that a word can mean two things at once. And so when you get into these analytic frameworks, you lose the density of meaning that can inhabit these cultural objects. And I think in the same breath, you also lose a lot of their value, right? That their significance as digital objects, not just as some intermediary form that is parsed and tagged so that it can later be analyzed. And in a lot of ways, the whole book is working against certain kinds of big analytical tendencies.
It's funny. It's making me think. So I had Carl Safina on the show, and he had made the case in his book that broadly the field of biology, in its pursuit of trying to have the prestige of physics, had gone the way of molecular biology and like knowing how things work kind of in their atomic, like proverbially and literally parts, rather than relationally as ecologies, had implicitly delegitimized ecological approaches, which, as we're seeing now, we desperately need.
Yeah.
There's an echo or a rhyme there for me with what you're arguing, kind of in sort of juxtaposing big data, the new oil, and the little database.
Yeah, and I don't want to throw babies out with bathwater, right? Like there are, I think the way I talk about it in the book, I have some line around like, shining genomic breakthroughs, right? Like massive amounts of computation can do great things. Like there are great things, but that's not usually the case. And when it comes to culture, that's very rarely the case, right? These are the same systems that are enabling pervasive surveillance and data valence, that are tracking our purchases for fintech futures, that are pre-authorizing our insurance based on what we buy to CVS. Like these are all in a lot of ways part of the same current. And so on one level, like, these massive algorithms can do a lot of good, like that there are real insights that they can offer. And I work with some large language models as part of the project to try and tease out some of the qualities and capabilities of those types of systems. But at the same time, like, I don't think that those operations have to be mutually exclusive. And I'll say, so a lot of the intervention the book is trying to make is methodological. And in my graduate study, I came up at a time where there were a lot of new methods were really being thrown out in the air. There was, say, Latour's intervention, why his critique ran out of steam, followed up by things like the hermeneutics of suspicion. There are alternate models, both in the digital humanities with these analytic trends, things like surface reading, things like, affect studies, new materialism, the infrastructural turn. There's a lot of like methods.
I can hear people like Googling on the side. Like,
like these are all like big turns, right? Like big fields, and, following on the linguistic turn, which had really, determined a lot of the ways in which we read literature, at least in English departments over the last 30 years previous. So all of these trends and all of these turns or modes of reading, these methods that are being released, are often contended as like absolutes, right? Like you can't critique is run out of steam, or, you have to attend to infrastructure, or you have to attend to affect. And I'm a methods nerd. Like I love reading through those books, but I also found that a lot of these tactics weren't incommensurate with each other. That you can run a poem through, say, 20 different frameworks, and each of those frameworks is going to open up a dimension of meaning that doesn't negate the other forms of meaning in that poem. It's an additive process. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is also scaling through different methods from really close and careful attention on the level of, say, the contingent effects of a specific type of data compression format to these like large scale effects of how, say, 30,000 sound files can interact together or be thought of as sort of like one object. And that these things aren't, again, incommensurate, but additive and can give us maybe a fuller understanding of these impossibly intricate webs that we find ourselves in.
I love that. I want to push deeper in this because it's funny because it's actually very, very straightforward and you're very lucid in the book. But we're conditioned, or I'll speak for myself, like I'm conditioned under such platform logic that I have to like rocket myself back in time to when those claws weren't in my brain. But part of what I love and what is so deft about your argument is you're talking about this relational interaction between the formats and then, broadly speaking, as you're saying, the methodologies. So it's not merely that you have a bunch of issues of Language Magazine, but it's that actually the software and the internetification of those things creates new possibilities for understanding. I'd love to invite you to share, one, broadly how you're thinking about that.
Yeah.
But two, if you could reference some of the examples from the book where that comes up.
Yeah, I'll step back to be a little bit autobiographical. Actually, I think to answer that question, the project really began when I started scanning things in. When I was an undergrad, I was a freshman, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and Craig Dworkin, my mentor, had brought me into as a work study student, as a labor practice, to scan in some old magazines, and they were just. I couldn't understand a single word. Like I was scanning in these like really hermetic, difficult, kind of high theory moment language periodicals. And I found it mystifying. Like I was just like absolutely enwrapped. And from that point forward, a lot of my education came from the sites that I study. So UbuWeb taught me the history of the avant-garde just by clicking through every link and watching or reading or listening to everything I possibly could. PennSound taught me more about how to read poetry, or probably more about how not to read poetry than anything else has. And so my education happened on these platforms, as I think for so many people. I grew up in rural Utah, and I don't have access to something like Anthology Film Archives, where I can see a Stan Brakhage film playing, but I could access it on YouTube as it emerged in the aughts when I started this project. So a lot of what I wanted to do is to try and take those experiences seriously and say, like, well, yeah, I didn't get to see Brakhage on celluloid, but it was still deeply meaningful. But it was meaningful in a weird way. And so I started to track, like, well, here's the transformations to this file and how Brakhage and its failure to render in Flash Video. Brakhage, of course, famously has these, like, quick flickers, which Flash Video is really bad at. Flash Video is a compression algorithm that's built for tracking like smooth movement. So if like someone walks across the screen, which is what most cinema, that's mostly what happens, it just tracks the movements of pixels. So when you have these like quick cuts where it like, goes from one to the other, it, like Flash Video just breaks. and what the real revelation I had, if Brakhage's original film was say to, try to tap into some kind of devotional experience of the transcendence of cinema. I mean, that's not what I got in my YouTube browser. I got this like messy block of pixels, but that transcendent cinema that Brakhage made somehow in its afterlife, completely by chance, completely based on a contingent set of conditions of the platform. Flash Video is not even around now. But at that moment, when I encountered it, Brakhage showed me what Flash actually looked like. Like it showed me, like through its failures to render that film, I felt like I was able to see Flash Video in a way that all these digital media platforms are constantly trying to erase their mediation, right? They're trying to become immediate to our view. And I found that these media-specific works of art and literature could actually, like in their failure to render, allowed us to see the platforms and the formats that facilitated them. And I think that was sort of, I think the origin point for a lot of the research that I was doing is how to, one, make sense of that encounter with Brakhage on YouTube, and two, how to give it its proper due, like how to like value the meaningful experience that I was having while watching it there. Or in other words, like how to see what we're seeing when we encounter our cultural memory objects on the internet.
And as you're saying, there are ways in which we can only really understand something by being confronted with its glitch or with its error. A sort of slanted kind of point of comparison I'd bring up is one exercise I inherited from a friend for poetry workshops. The very first exercise that I'll assign in class is write the worst poem you can possibly write.
That's good.
And it is the best way to start the class because one, it creates a context where everybody feels like it's funny and they are free to do whatever. But by other people's, like, for example, one of my pet peeves is like everybody's, adherence to having to rhyme and like make it more of like a lyric in a song. But when people think of the worst poem they can possibly write, they often make it like rhymey in a saccharine way.
Yeah.
So we can talk about right out of the gate why that type of rhyming makes us feel like it's cheesy. And I'm not going to say that it fully erases the like cheesy rhyme schemes you get in poetry workshops henceforth, but I assume that it's at least diminishing it to a certain extent. And so there are all these moments where that you're identifying where that type of slippage and like the Brackage film create a new valence to understand the original piece of media. And one moment I love to that effect is Zen for Film on YouTube, where you have a scroller bar that a very dedicated person maybe will just put it on YouTube, put it on their screen, hands off. Yeah. But we can imagine a lot of people probably won't do that, and they might kind of scrub through, and they'll then relate to that film in a totally different way than it was originally intended, or even it wasn't even imagined that it could be sort of engaged with in that way.
Yeah, and I think, I love this poetry experiment. I want to tell you about one that I did similar, but to linger with Zen for Film for a moment, part of what I found Zen for Film on YouTube so fascinating is, one, it reveals a certain like ideological perspective on what a film is supposed to be, right? So is Zen for Film, if it's just like a white square, which is sort of what you saw on YouTube, then you're missing all the things that are actually interesting about that work, right? Like Craig Dorkin has written, really persuasively about the soundtrack, which is all about the clacking and clattering of the projector. And Cage famously, when talking about Zen for Film, maybe the best reader of that work. Zen for Film, of course, is an entirely blank leader that plays at variable lengths. The digitized version, you see this kind of just like it's just like a white square. And so, yeah, maybe there's like a concept of Zen there, but you're missing all the sounds, which I think is like a big part of the work. But you're also missing what Cage said was great about the film was the dust and particles and scratches that passed through the projector. And he said that those bits of dust took on these little characters, and it would be like a comedy or a kind of narrative. And of course, this rhymes with Cage's own sense of 4:33, his most famous composition, 4 minutes and 33 minutes of silence, which is never actually silence, right? Like it's what you hear are the breath, the breathing of the people around you, shuffling of feet, creaking floorboards, and importantly, Cage actually moving the pages. So the piece is actually full of sound, but it's sound that registers at a more minute and more intimate level. And that's what Zen for Film was originally all about. So when you just see this like blank white square on your YouTube, you're missing all of the dust particles, you're missing all those things, but then it begs you to ask, like, what are you actually saying? And one of the things that I loved about the YouTube version is that you see that the white is not stable. It's like little bits of pixels are trying to get the right white. And so like the characters that Cage saw in those bits of dust, I think you can see those same characters in the pixels on your screen. And that media reflexivity, that moment, I think is kind of magic where like for a second, like I'm not just transported or absorbed into whatever YouTube video essay I happen to be watching that week, but I'm thinking about YouTube as a platform as a whole, as a file format, as a streaming device, and a whole system of semantic inputs that radiate out from that film. Can I talk about breaking things more?
Please.
I love this idea of like, you can learn about a poem by trying to make the worst possible poem. In my experimental games class, I gave my students, I think one of my favorite assignments we ever did, which is how to break Mario. Like, can you break Mario? Like Mario, like how do you kill or break Mario? My students have and we have like a round robin tournament to see who can make the most broken Mario. Like Mario famously like dies over and over again, but keeps coming back. So it's like, well, like, can you break Mario by like flipping out the colors that he, his iconic red and blue look? Or what if you like render Mario as like a non-Italian person? Like, is that one way to break him? Or I don't know, subject him to some kind of BDSM torture? Is that going to break Mario? Like the students would come up with all these really inventive ways of trying to break Mario, but in trying to come up with strategies to break something, you reveal a whole array of dimensions of what that thing is that you simply couldn't see otherwise. And this is something that I return to quite often in the book, where when these websites break down, when text.com, for example, got taken down by a lawsuit, you could see quite a bit about what it was doing on the internet at the time. When Eclipse went down because of university restructuring of its servers, it brought a whole range of coding decisions, design formatting, contextual operations. All these things came into view in the moment when it broke down. And in here, I think I'm a little bit indebted to Latour and this idea of demystification, where, I don't get deep into Latour, but, one great nugget is that like a car is like a vehicle that moves you around until it breaks down, and then it's a series of discrete pieces that have to be investigated. And so once a system like an engine or a car or a web platform breaks down, then you can see its parts a little bit better.
Totally. I'm sort of taking us on this tangent a little more just because I'm like, but this issue of link rot, I feel like, is something that deserves a lot more attention. And I'm wondering if when you were doing research for this book, coming back to this source material of your own, this little database you've made, when you originally were writing it, and you reference some of this in the book, 15 years have passed. Did you find that it was difficult sort of finding certain things, or were there moments where the Wayback Machine wasn't yielding what you were looking for?
Oh my God, Jesse, I have more moments like that than I could possibly recount. And this is, books are long things. Like books are these like slow durational objects. And so there's bits and pieces from this book that really, I've been thinking about for the last 2 decades. And, I started writing it when I was writing about things like PennSound and UbuWeb in the 20-aughts that were like cutting edge new stuff on the internet. Like here we are. And now, from like almost 20 years distance, it's become a kind of historical study of what the internet was, what kind of latent potentials it might have had. But also it's like ongoing disappearance. So I think I address this most clearly in the epilogue on the EPC, which for a tiny moment, this is one of my favorite anecdotes that I discovered while writing this. For a tiny moment, the Electronic Poetry Center, this fantastic collection at the University of Buffalo, what used to be at the University of Buffalo, was the largest website on the internet. That this like weird collection of poems just happened to be slightly larger for a small sliver of time than the CIA's database, simply because like when the HTTP protocol went live, Los Pequeño Glazier, the archivist and co-founder of the EPC, had a ton of materials that he'd already digitized that he was ready to just like upload them all at once. But
Put me in the game, coach.
yeah, and I love this, and it's like there's these great little stories that happen with these platforms. So from its the debutante ball of the HTTP protocol, it being the largest website on the internet, now like when you search EPC, it is the 44th hit on Google search. Like it's not even the top hit for its own name. And I found that fascinating. And that history is built out of link rot. So the servers where it had gained all this algorithmic page rank clout had gone down. They moved the EPC to the University of Pennsylvania where they could preserve it better. That in moving the website, a bunch of the website, again, it broke down. There are lots of pieces I could and couldn't find. The EPC is like early internet stuff, so there are all these imaginaries of what the internet could be before we had these established mores and genres of internet production. So, for example, it had a listing of every poet's email address, which is a kind of like privacy nightmare now, but was at the time, I guess, like a thing that was normal. There's a set of like obituaries that the site was constantly publishing. So thinking about this like maintenance or care for members of the community who had passed are written into it. It had things like hot lists. There were just like all these like page count, like, page visitor counts, like all of these like anachronistic things that I think are still really interesting, especially as we have as we've seen, like increasingly we live in these filter bubbles driven by 5 companies and, just as many people profiting off of everything we click and look at. This earlier internet had other ideas of what it could have been. And so I think like returning to these dead web pages, these web pages that had other kinds of expectations of what the internet could be, I think is still very inspiring. And I think in a digital spaces that increasingly feel like foreclosed, where there is no exit and no option, and like we just need to, and I agree in a lot of ways with with John Crary that we just need to scorch the internet. Like there's no future for us unless we just destroy the entire thing. There's still liberatory potentials, I think, in some of these earlier imaginaries. And yeah, I probably have more to say about that, but
We'll get there. We'll get
stop
there.
here. Yeah.
Well, because I realize we've spent a good amount of time talking about subjects in the book, and we have much more to go. But I did want to take a moment for folks who are maybe listening and kind of like wanting to understand how this is organized in book format. Could you talk a little bit about the structure of the book, and in particular kind of highlight why you chose to kind of stagger the chapters the way you did? Because I think that informs how like the content comes through.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Jesse. Getting us back on track with a great question. So the book, I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm very lucky to have come out of an experimental program that encouraged me to make something so weird. And since then, I did my graduate study at University of Pennsylvania. I did a postdoc at Northwestern. I've been here at UCLA for the last 8 years. A lot of what I want to do is produce a space for my students and for future scholars to like experiment and play, to break out of standard academic conventions, which have their merit, but also have their limitations, right? There's other ways to build knowledge than just the standard essay. So this project was always meant to be a kind of multimedia object that contained many things. We've got some of them out here on the table. It's very, very nice of you to pull everything out. But the book contains, for example, executable text, which is a Python-generated work of theory poetry, allowing the text.com collection to theorize itself. It contains an MP3 remix, a video remix, a weird bootleg magazine. And then as I was trying to finally finish the book and write the index, which is always the last piece of any book, is you write the index to map, well, here's where all the subjects are, here's the things you want to find if you're using codex-based search methods. I got really obsessed with the format and also the anachronism of the index, which is bound up to these paper-bound objects, which, to be honest, I don't use nearly as often as I use PDFs that I find on the internet. And I search for things using Command F. I don't turn to the index. So I got really interested in that format and then wrote a whole other book using a large language model to have a book that was generated by its index instead of the other way around. I can talk more about that. Anyways, so I'm sorry for taking the long way around to answer your question.
Take as long as you want. It's great.
But the book, so it's making arguments. And again, this is where I'm thinking these things aren't incommensurate. So it has standard, it's got a standard, it's a 4-chapter book with an introduction and an epilogue in some ways, with 4 interludes. And the chapters are organized to look at roughly file formats. So text files, image files, sound files, and movie files. Alongside those files, and a lot of this is a kind of game, right? Like it's a performance, and I've long come from a tradition where scholarship is a performative art. I start from like a large scale, like trying to look at a whole collection, and then I look at one run of magazines, and then I look at a small set of sound files, and then finally I do some close readings of some specific films, which then explode back out to connect to the network at large. So in each of the chapters, I'm looking at a file format, I'm asking a kind of question, and then I'm trying to perform those same questions otherwise. So when I'm looking at plain text files, I write a chapter, do my diligent scholarly work to analyze what happened to this website, text.com, which is kind of like the original pirate website. But then I wanted to perform it differently in a more creative way. And so I had, so text.com, for example, was a early piece of net art activism, edited by Sebastian Lutgert, very versed in sort of cyberpunk theory. There's a lot of William Gibson in there, but also like alternative stuff that you might imagine like somebody wearing a trench coat in 2000 would want to read. So it's like Kathy Acker and Douglas Adams and Guy Debord. It's like a weird assortment of stuff. So again, it resists analytics, right? There's no, and it's in like 4 different languages. So you're not going to get a lot of like analytic meaning by plugging this into something like Voyant or any other kind of data analytics tool. But it has like a whole theoretical background of text that it's working from. So I wanted to try to let text.com theorize itself. I had this perverse idea when I was writing my dissertation that all the citations in that chapter would just be drawn from the collection. So I could like use the collection to theorize its own operations. That proved to be not so interesting and kind of hard. But I was like, well, I could still do that as a book. So I wrote a Python script that drew out some core terms and then shuffled them together. So like the text.com collection could theorize its own relationship to text. And each chapter, I do this kind of like 2-step process where there's an academic chapter followed by an interlude that includes a kind of creative remix within the media that the chapter is looking at itself.
Great.
Like I said, long way around, but does that make sense?
That was
Okay.
amazing. Staying on executable text, which, as I've told you, I always want to say X text, because maybe I'm misremembering this. Didn't he kind of coin that kind of phrase as text.com, like the work that text.com was doing?
Yeah, so he has a great word that I love, textwares, TEXTWAREZ, like, you know, from like the wares scene or the demo scene from the 90s and the aughts. And that idea I found really inspiring and beautiful. And yes, the chapter and the creative intervention both kind of emerge out of this idea. So all of the works are in dialogue with the collections I'm looking at, the specific works I'm looking at. Throughout, I try to retain this sense of, you know, contingent specificity with whatever it is that I'm trying to analyze. But textwares, he argued, so in the same way that like whereas is like a cracked bit of software. So you can imagine like Final Cut Pro, back in the day when it wasn't like rooted in the cloud.
I don't know what
somehow.
you're talking about. I've never heard of this.
But you could like download like a cracked software and there's a whole scene of people cracking software for people to freely use it on their own devices. The editor made this great argument that the texts, these like plain text files, so say like a great example would be like Guy Debord, Society of the Spectacle, that it operates as a piece of software, not on a computational system, but in the mind of the reader, right? That the text is like operating on you in the same way that a piece of software might. I think there's a lot that I say a lot. I spend a good 40 pages talking about that. So I won't get into too much depth here, but that idea was so inspiring to me. That the idea that like, yes, a text can change your life. These texts operate on us. And that computational metaphor I found like really poignant and beautiful to think again about these meaningful encounters we have with digital objects when we encounter them. So each of the chapters tries to like parse in both directions, and textwares in particular, I'm so glad that you brought that to mind, was the idea that I was trying to develop by making the creative work. So taking not just the concept textwares and parsing it as a scholar, but taking that concept seriously and seeing, well, what kind of poem or what kind of theory would that idea generate?
Well, and it's funny. I mean, again, all of a piece. Index is doing that work in a somewhat literal fashion, like taking it. Yes, it happens in the mind, but also like in that reverse extrapolation, it also is sort of becoming executable text. Spend a little bit more time. You kind of glossed over both index and are we calling it anti-language? What are we calling it?
It's like
unlanguage?
Profoundly unpronounceable. Actually, my editors forced me to take out the equal signs. I mean, it was a great suggestion to take out the equal signs for speech to text devices. So for low vision or vision impaired folks. I know we both listen to a lot of books with automated voices reading them to us, and there's nothing worse than like having to hear L equals A equals N equals G, or in this case, L doesn't equal A, doesn't equal N, and so on. So yeah, this book, this was a very famous document, at least it's so funny to say, like famous in the teacup I live, like a very famous document in experimental poetry. It was a poetics journal that really kind of worked to help found and build what we call language writing, which is roughly defined, again, mostly by a cluster of writers that center around a series of little magazines. So it's like a lot of 20th century literary movements. It's a movement that begins and is really is both begins in, is carried by, and is defined by the little magazines it inhabits. Like the role of little magazines in 20th century avant-garde, modernist, and experimental writing cannot be overstated, which is part of why I find that recoding of the little database alongside the little magazine really useful. Here, so I take this like canonical magazine that is quite famous. It's on the Eclipse archive. Anyone can access it for free, and decided to like try to think about. Well, I write about that magazine quite a bit in my chapter, so I won't rehearse the argument for languages, various remediations on the Eclipse archive. But with each of the chapters, I wanted to do something playful. And this one came out of this remarkable thing that I found through the Allen Institute for AI. Did this great piece of investigative journalism for the Washington Post, where they built a search bar to return to so it was a kind of fetch quest. They built a search bar where you could find what websites had been scraped to produce C4. This is the corpus, the colossal clean corpus that most large language models have used or are pretty certain to use in the background. And I found all these websites I was writing about, these like radical, weird approaches to language, UbuWeb, PennSound, Eclipse, had all been absorbed by this corpus. So somewhere in the deep, dark heart of the evil that is ChatGPT is like a radical set of poems and language poets, it should be, remembered, are most well known for trying to break linguistic norms, who came of age in the 70s and 80s, a kind of high theory moment, very much guided by the linguistic turn, to think about the artifice of language, its constructiveness, to think about the police in our mouths, to think that the politics of form, of poetic form, are meaningful, are deeply meaningful in contingent and socially historical ways. So I was like, great, there's this resistant model, this like shadow, this ghost in the shell of ChatGPT somewhere that even as ChatGPT churns out sentences that mostly sound like they're written by, I don't know, an 8th grade English student or by a Redditor.
A very polite one.
A very polite one. Yeah, very polite, very positive, delusionally so. Like somehow like deep within it knows language poetry. And so with this project, with language does not equal, I was trying to get it to remember. So I was using ChatGPT to rewrite the entirety of the original magazine, retaining its design, layout, and word count, but updating it to theorize itself in relationship to large language models. So again, it's a kind of playful approach, but I think like this language does not equal or not equals language is giving us ways of understanding that confluence of experimental writing and large language models, that the idea that little language models live inside the large language models, that an essay just couldn't do, right? Like I can make certain kinds of arguments in the essay, but with a production like this, like every line is doing something different. Like every discrete creative decision, the bits of diction, the bits of layout, the ways in which these things get transformed, that exceeds any kind of close reading. And again, I don't think that they have to be put in contrast, but this opens up one view into that very influential magazine that my essay just couldn't do. And so in each of these instances, the chapters and the interludes are kind of working together to open up different dimensions of these cultural objects.
So I remember when you had first started doing Language Does Not Equal. And unfortunately, to ask this question, I have to get into the dreaded AI of it all.
Let's go there.
So yeah, I think we have to. And you were one of the first people I was talking to who was meaningfully, creatively using ChatGPT, which that version of ChatGPT 3.5 or whatever GPT it was then is sort of laughably quaint now. But even then, you were identifying the creative potential of ChatGPT. Different world, things have happened. I guess maybe a a way in to start the conversation is talk to me about those early moments, starting what would become Language Does Not Equal, and your experience working with ChatGPT to produce that.
Yeah, there's so many things I want to say all at once, so I'll try and keep myself linear. It was 2023, which is a really different moment, and I remember those conversations that we both had at that time. Whereas, those of us who were just tracking the development of the technology from text to transformer through to, I think it was 3.5, this point where it's like, it was like that moment where it's like, oh my God, this changes everything, right? And we've seen that play out. And I certainly wouldn't use ChatGPT now. I still teach, I teach a class at UCLA called Algo Lit, which is a critical AI course that uses AI to try to develop critiques of AI systems. And in that class, I don't use ChatGPT at all. I have my students use Mistral, other local models, small models that focus on data privacy. Of course, this is before the war on Gaza, before a lot of the developments we've seen these technologies put toward in the last 2 to 3 years. But even then, it was very clear that this was a transformative technology, and transformative in really profound and manifold ways. At the very top of that list is just thinking about basic modes of access to knowledge. And I was thinking to go back to the search bar, right? So if we've been using, say, for the last 2 or 3 decades, search bars as our way to find knowledge, increasingly, and you'll see this when someone shares a link with you now, it always has the appended ChatGPT URL marker. I've been tracking that when my students send me links, when friends send me links. It used to be maybe you'd get the tracker from Facebook, but you get these little residual signals that this is where this knowledge was found. And the way that it operates, the way that it transforms our knowledge, I think is unparalleled and obviously unfolding, mostly for the worse. Again, to be very clear, almost entirely for the worse. That said, right, like if this technology is so transformative, it is changing our relationship to knowledge, our relationship to cultural memory, and of course, it's all built out of the very internet that we've been looking at and studying for the last 2 decades. Then I think it's too important to ignore, and too important not to try to understand not just the economics of the politics of those questions are essential, but the prosody of ChatGPT, the poetics, like what kinds of things does this machine say? How does it say them? Like this is a poetry lesson that form matters, that form and content are intertwined. And so with this project, very early on, I was trying to think, how can you use an AI system to try to surface some of the prosodic features of that system? And that prosody matters not just for users who are coming up with things like prompt craft, right? Like different ways to get GPT or any large language model to give you the kind of output you're looking for. But how those outputs have a feedback relationship to our own understandings of ourselves, of the world around us. We've seen reports of like ChatGPT induced delusions and psychosis. These are real effects that I think we have to actually get our hands dirty with, for lack of a better word, to try to understand how they work so that we can better fight against them.
We've talked about our respective, not hesitancy, but sort of that really sort of morally fraught, complex feeling of teaching in this vein at this moment in history, and where the position we share is you have to understand them to effectively critique, subvert, intervene, etc. And we can look around and see that the way that these things were made reflect a lack of a humanist impulse. And so therefore there need to be more humanities people intervening. And so if we, run the transitive property, that means we need more humanities people to at least have a basic literacy with how they work. In terms of that effort you were undertaking, did you find that language poetry was an ideal vehicle to get into some of those revelations? Was it frustrating? Like, And maybe let's do a little rewind too, because you described it earlier in the conversation, but maybe for folks who are like coming totally green to language poetry, if you could sketch what language poetry is and then move forward into whether or not it was generative.
How it works. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. So, and again, like language poetry or language writing movement is a really heterogeneous set of strategies. But insofar as they do cohere, I think that they cohere around resisting certain normative presumptions about literary production. So the new sentence is maybe one famous output of this, developed mostly by Ron Silliman in dialogue with many others, that takes like normal sentences and breaks them down, right? So it's a lot of like shuffling language, breaking language down. My mentor in grad school was Charles Bernstein, who famously wrote about the artifice of absorption, and I think this is a useful entry point into thinking about large language models, and normative form. So. A novel or other literary modes like the essay are built on an idea of absorption, right? Like if you can look through the text into the world of ideas, then you're sort of like fully absorbed in that text. Anybody who's gotten deep into a novel and 2 hours have suddenly flown by, have a sense of what this feels like. Language poetry is always about resisting that, right? So like keeping you on the surface of language as a material substrate, as something that has formal properties that doesn't allow you to jump into these absorptive states. I think that's really useful in a lot of ways. ChatGPT, as we've seen, is really good at producing absorptive narrative spaces. Some of the earliest text-to-transformer experiments I remember were about like, what was it, archaeologists discovering a unicorn, and it like convincingly giving us this kind of like fantasy sci-fi story. I see it all the time, as do many of my colleagues. ChatGPT is really good at writing the college seminar essay. It's really good. And it's good because that form is so normative and so standard and has a very like rigid set of genre markers that it can mimic quite convincingly. So given the normative outputs of something like ChatGPT that produce these kinds of absorptive texts, language poetry and language poetics are useful to try to break that system, to let it break down. Like forcing it to try to write a new sentence is actually quite hard. You have to do a lot of prompting to get it to produce those kinds of outputs, and its resistance to that prompting always teaches me something about it that I wouldn't know otherwise. I think that's the most inspiring bits of AI art and literature that I've seen that use these generative systems are usually geared around coming up with novel, poetic, or aesthetic strategies to get these black boxes to reveal something about themselves that you couldn't see from the outside. And I think this is never more the case than when you read one of these think pieces by somebody who's clearly never worked with an AI model, like somebody complaining that AI systems aren't great. Look, I told it to write a story in this style and it failed. Well, that's like a failure of understanding how it works and the art of and poetics and prosody of prompt craft. But these black boxes hide a lot of horrors inside of them as well. And so I think like the best works of art and literature usually are surfacing things like bias, for example, bias around gender or race, or ability, that there's all of these various ways of getting these systems to reveal what's otherwise hidden within them. And so in a lot of ways that process mirrors what I'm trying to do with the little database as a whole, to get these otherwise invisible structuring logics to reveal themselves. And like it's like a game of trying to trick them into revealing themselves by making them break down, by getting them to produce a form that they're not trained to reproduce.
And as you were doing it, what was the I don't know, what was the feeling you were having when you would have these moments that felt like you were achieving that?
It's like a combination of like delight and horror. It's like being thrilled. It's like, oh, like I found this thing. And usually it's like, oh my God, I wish I hadn't have found this thing. Like they go hand in hand. And then there's also like the horror of like how adept and how quickly they've changed, right? From 2023 to 2025. I mean, we've moved from what I think the standard example is Will Smith eating spaghetti to high fidelity sci-fi films being produced on a daily basis that are, you know, really difficult to even recognize. I think this week it was bunnies jumping on a trampoline. There's a new one every single week. And when I teach my classes, I have to just keep up with, okay, here are both the popular forms to which these large language models are being put to use. And here are, you know, I think a cadre of critical AI scholars, artists, and writers who are trying to use these systems to make them reveal the hidden political structuring, the lapses in the data sets, the various kind of, you know, biased organizational logics that they have somewhere in their core. And because these models are so large, and this comes back to questions of scale, because they're so incomprehensibly large, they resist, and it's like the other side of the mirror. They also resist analytics, right? Like the you know, it's a commonly known fact that even data scientists have a hard time understanding what unsupervised models are actually doing underneath the hood. And so I think like these like little interventions, these like small outputs, these experiments with systems, with large language models and other types of generative systems can reveal things that would just be impossible to see otherwise. And here I think there's a real use to not just poetry in general, but like experimental forms of poetry that try to break language down. Again, fighting against these like normative forms as a way to reveal new types of knowledge that you couldn't access.
I love that. As somebody who spends a lot of time, we've been talking about ChatGPT largely, but you mentioned Mistral. You've experimented with a bunch of other LLMs and video generators and image generators. Yeah, I mean, it's a deluge. From where we're sitting today in mid-ish 2025, what are the things that have your attention from a that you're concerned about?
I don't even know where to start with that list. I don't mean to laugh, but all of it, you know, starting with the war on Gaza, and starting from like the real algorithmic harms, algorithmic violence that these systems are producing. So I think like there's an urgency to these studies, and so like it scales from like actual harm, decimation, and genocide that is ongoing in the present to like these like quotidian. Like you have to put them in the same sentence. Like putting them in the same sentence feels horrifying, right? As part of this horror, like I don't know, my colleagues here stressing out about their students having plagiarized essays through ChatGPT, and the ways in which large language models have rendered some of these like load bearing generic conventions of academe irrelevant or not necessarily irrelevant, but they have to change. If the writing of an essay was never about what was actually written in the essay, it was about the mental gymnastics and work and labor that one has to do to cultivate a critical understanding of the world. If that genre can just be output by a prompt, then there has to be other ways that we can develop our critical insight on the world around us. And so a lot of the experiments I'm doing and a lot of the community of artists and writers that I'm invested in are, I think, looking for new strategies and new ways to develop the critical perspectives that we so desperately need to fight the horrors of these systems. And I think to do that, one has to find out how to converse with them in a different way.
I want to follow up on, when you did that sort of scale thing, I was thinking of the meme where there's the little domino and it scales up to like pylon sized. I kind of want to hit both, and so I'm going to throw both at you, and then player's choice, how we sort of enter it. On the one hand, I want to go deeper on the issue of plagiarism. I love what you're saying around it being a mode of thought rather than about the output. And I think there's more in this conversation that I don't see being said, and I suspect you will say really enlightening things. And then I also want to seek more clarification for folks who might not be familiar. You've referenced a couple of times the algorithmic violence brought on, corollary to, and driven by the war on Gaza. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a network of systems, right? And so I think when talking about algorithmic violence, I think we often have this perception that the digital realm and the real world are sort of like these like separate entities that maybe touch along our fingertips when we're at a keyboard, but otherwise are just operating in the background. And of course, that's never been the case. From scholars like Simone Brown, whose Dark Matters is incredibly important to me, thinking about surveillance and data valence, a term that Rita Rayleigh I think is most prominent for developing. Algorithmic systems have been watching us and watching us for systems of control. A lot of my training came out of Deleuze and Alex Galloway in a kind of like heyday of that type of thought. Hart and Negri from the aughts and the early teens around what Deleuze called a control society. So the idea that information systems and computers in particular exercised a new form of power, not the biopower, the disciplinary society. Sorry, I'm getting like going through my paces of like the theory discourse, but it's it's helpful to remind oneself that this is where we come from. That that Foucault theorized from institutional forms of power that train bodies to be docile, using institutional state apparatuses in Althusser's terms. That from those I think the example is like from a teacher like whapping you with a yardstick to keep you docile. We have these forms of flexible control where the prices on one commodity go slightly down, and so you are nudged toward buying that thing. Or you're incentivized to behave in a certain kind of way because if you don't, you're not going to go to prison, you're not going to get beat, but like maybe you won't get good insurance, right? So it's these like systems of, and this comes out of like the cybernetic imaginary. I reread the Tikkun book, which I should plug. It's so good. The cybernetic systems that have kept us in these kinds of control states. Okay, that's like background. That's all before the rise of large language models. So like to get to large language models, you kind of have to like go through those paces and the forms of control and the forms of violence that large language models and other forms of synthetic cognition are producing are not just like on a wholly new scale, but I think take dramatically different forms that require us to revise our understanding of sovereignty, revise our understanding of control, and revise our system of like our understanding of what kinds of harms algorithms can produce. So just to use the example of the war on Gaza, there's not just the data valence of specific targets, tracking faces, drone strikes themselves, missile operating systems, in the same way that like it seems every industry from film to writing to how we order our food for delivery are increasingly subject to large language models. Of course, these military systems are using the same types of models. And these models, importantly, again, are profoundly biased, prone to egregious errors, and often have very little oversight. So it's one thing if, say, like your laptop computer doesn't recognize your face because you're the wrong race or the wrong gender or have the wrong set of identity coordinates in general. It's something very different if that's a targeting system from a drone. Does that's like legwork stuff, but I think that's, I mean, so, and I think this is part of what, keeps me up at night. This is part of what animates the kind of research that I'm trying to do and the kind of teaching I'm trying to do at UCLA, which is to connect these like what look like playful and frivolous literary experiments to the very real and increasingly existentially threatening technologies that surround us everywhere, that are changing everything from the climate, as you cover so beautifully in this podcast and in so many of your episodes, to all of the urgent futures that are awaiting us, that are being written by systems that we don't quite understand. And I come from a background and rooted in a lot of reading of Kittler and Nietzsche and Emerson around the idea that our writing tools are working on our thoughts. So the technologies we use to write are never transparent, ideology-free transmission systems. What John Turin Peters calls the communication of angels. That there's never a communication channel without noise in it. And if we don't understand the ways that our writing technologies are working on our thoughts, then we don't have a way to resist them, or better, and ideally someday, to write them otherwise.
I love that. Full stop. Not full stop on the show, of course. Yeah, I really appreciate that you shared that, because I think for a lot of people who don't kind of spend their days stressing about this, it's kind of like, yeah, okay, there's ChatGPT and there's like AI slop and whatever, and I know I probably shouldn't use it, but you know, I don't feel like writing my email, and this will be a really good way of writing my email or whatever. But it really is all of these interlocking systems. Like, it feels like there's no good metaphor from where I sit. Maybe you'll have an amazing metaphor, but it feels like I have no good metaphor to describe the lock-in from every angle that feels like is happening. Where it's like, if anything, ChatGPT is still just the kind of like fun, silly, you know, kind of like face of a much deeper and more entrenched system that spans essentially all industries. And people in positions of power understand that much more thoroughly than even your average informed person.
Yeah.
So yeah, when you were talking about the ways it's being used in Gaza and because of Gaza, and I mean, you didn't even get into the like suppression of speech on social media platforms. Like there's so many ways that it echoes that are only felt in their absence.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I know that it was kind of like a kind of elementary 101 style question, but I really appreciate you rising to it.
No, it wasn't. And I think, you know, it raises something that to, you know, draw back to what I'm trying to do in the book as well, is that, you know, even before we get to large language models, the situation of just trying to understand any given digital object on these platforms already exhausts an interpretive equation. That like, you know, you asked me to like, oh, what are you most worried about? And it's like, I have a laundry list. I was just trying to give some extremes, but like, you know, there's a laundry list, not just of like, of new challenges that these things present, challenges to trying to understand how they work, or, you know, God willing, like intervene in them in some way. So beyond that list of challenges that these systems present, I think they also resist traditional modes of reading, and they resist like absolute forms of comprehension. One can't know a large language model. It is like a friend of mine described as a solid state God. It's like something that knows everything, but it also knows nothing. It's incredibly stupid and incredibly sophisticated at the same time. And so these like new forms that we're still trying to wrap our reptilian brains around require, I think, these other ways of trying to pierce their black boxes, of trying to understand how they work. This is something that art and poetry has always been good at. Marshall McLuhan famously talked about, you know, avant-garde poetry as a kind of advanced probe in technological systems. So, you know, for McLuhan, you can only really understand a technology after it had become obsolete, but that the hints and the signs and the indices of how that technology worked could be probed by artists that are testing it as it's developed. And usually you can only see that in hindsight, in retrospect. But our technology is changing so fast, and large language models change day to day, week to week, month to month in ways that are incomprehensible. And so having my students experiment with these systems, doing my own experiments, tracking what other writers and artists are doing to try to like pierce like just small sections, you know, almost like taking like a small like cellular sample so you can analyze something that might have some like larger systemic impacts, but is actually a very specific and contingent encounter with an otherwise impossibly complex system. I think this is something that I'm advocating for, and something that I hope also kind of empowers art and poetry, not as some kind of like, you know, poetry. And James Sherry said this in the most famous way, which is that poetry is the only medium that devalues the materials it uses. That a blank sheet of paper is worth more than a sheet of paper with a poem on it. You know, it's not the same with painting, right? It's like value additive. And so like if poetry has no intrinsic material value, it's actually devaluing the materials it uses maybe its value is in the ways it can help us to understand, as it always has for Wordsworth or Coleridge, for like understand our relationship to nature and the cosmos. I just think that trying to understand a large language model is maybe like trying to understand nature and the cosmos, and we need poetic forms and aesthetic forms that are capable of giving us some glimpses of these otherwise, transcendent hyper objects.
That's, I mean, coming back to the pedagogical side of this, that this is very much a drum that I feel myself banging a lot, is like, obviously most of my critique lies with the people that you're implicitly and explicitly sort of naming. On the flip side, I feel a lot of frustration at folks that I feel very otherwise politically aligned with, where there's this knee-jerk no. Like, I'm not touching any of that, and not only am I not touching it, I'm not even going to bother to try to learn about it. Because I think it's sort of multiple levels. Like, if you believe that those tools shouldn't exist and you want to stand for their abolition, great. But also, if you're going to stand for their abolition, you need to really understand why. And so knowing how they work then becomes like, the onus becomes even greater to then really kind of like know your enemy. And there's this moment for artists and creative people to step up and do the work you're doing of like, kind of, as you said, sort of poking or piercing, and like, not to sort of, be like, sort of overly freight this with gravitas, but it's like, it is urgent. Like, I don't know how else to say it. It is urgent. Like, the walls are closing in. I'm saying it with a smile, but we all know that it's not the type of thing you smile about. And so we just desperately need creative people. And a lot of those creative people happen to be on the political left. And a lot of there's a pretty, healthy middle section of a Venn diagram of those people who are just like, and making bad critiques, where it's like, a critique that I might agree with, but with poor data or poorly stated, is only hurting us. So I just, that's a long way of saying I really appreciate the work you're doing and what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think there's room for all kinds. I love a neo-Luddite. I love, and I'll step back. To reference Jonathan Crary once more in our conversation, I taught a grad seminar this past year, very much aligned with the project, I think, of Urgent Futures, on called it Speculative Games and Media Poetics. So we're kind of looking as a video game study class, doing a lot of media poetics, like I'm trying to do in this book. But really like geared around questions of speculation, like how is the future rendered? What kinds of extrapolations can we make? Are there possible futures for us out there? And like as a real question, at this point, like, is there a future that's possible? And I started the class because I thought it was so important to start with scorched earth. It's like, if we're going to imagine any kind of future, we have to like begin maybe, which I should just rehearse, is this incredibly punk rock tract from Jonathan Crary, famous from Techniques of the Observer, among many, many other interventions, the great book on 24/7 Capital. But in Scorched Earth, he really advocates for just like, there's no, like, his argument is that like, there's no way to intervene in these systems to produce any kind of positive change except for to burn them all down. Like, we have to just like fully unplug.
It's a master's tools.
It's a kind of master's tools thing, kind of. It's really like a radical kind of like internet abolitionist document. And I find it very provocative. And I think that there's lots of room for those perspectives. Like I do, I respect like my peers and the people you're describing, my students, who increasingly don't want to touch AIs. And it's kind of surprising. Like I'm teaching this class called Algo Lit, Critical AI, Introduction to Critical AI Studies. And about half the students are like absolutely abolitionists. Like they will not touch a large language model, which is kind of amazing. It's like showing up to like, I don't know, like a psychoanalysis seminar and saying like, I refuse to read a word of Freud. Like it's just like, well, interesting. Like, and so rather than take that as like a challenge to the class, it's actually been, I think, one of the most beneficial parts of the class is we had students from a whole range of ways of wanting to interact with these media, coming up with like creative ways to try to intervene in these discourses. And so like, I agree, like, writing a hot take that's ill-informed is not the most useful thing for the discourse. For my students who don't want to touch AI, they would make thinking of one in particular that made this like beautiful comic book about AI systems based on a series of conversations and artworks we had seen, that they weren't producing any generative work, but they were engaging with the materials in a way that they simply wouldn't have if they hadn't been studying the actual outputs of generative AI. So I think that there's ways to, fight the good fight against these systems without necessarily feeding back into their training data
Absolutely.
sets, the economics of subscription, the university making partnerships, say, with tech companies, many tech companies. Yeah. And so like I think that it takes all kinds, and I think it requires I think this is something I hadn't. Thank you for this question. Like I think it requires, like, there's not one answer to these problems, and the more kinds of answers, or the more kinds of questions that are variant, not just in theme or topic, but variant in form and practice, the better a view and the better position we might be in to both understand and ideally demystify or defang these bloodsuckers. Yeah.
Amen. Amen to that. Well, let me ask you then, how does this, like everything you just said, we're moving from the pylon that topples down to the little baby domino. How does this interact in your mind with the plagiarism hair on fire moment that has been happening but continues to unfold?
Yeah, this is something that I've had to. I feel like my mind has gone in a number of different directions over the years. Right, I came of age. We were talking in the break a little bit about torrenting and LimeWire and Pirate Bay, and this idea of like a leftist countercultural file sharing internet, which was theorized as a kind of gift economy or a digital commons. Well, like those same systems are the ones that feed directly into large language models and training data, producing, and I think like producing real harms also for creative artists, for novelists, for writers, for scholars, whose works have been and used, and increasingly, if everyone's just plugged into ChatGPT, which as we know mostly just outputs direct content from its training data. It's not always inventing every new sentence you read from its output. It's often just straight up regurgitating something else. If you can just turn to that, then that has further deleterious effects for the creative industries. Talking about copyright, I resist getting too deep into copyright because there's so much good work out there. Peter Descherney, I think, has been doing really great work for a long time on questions of copyright and control, and tracking the legal history of fair use, how that's been litigated. Of course, like for me, like in the 90s and the aughts, the bad guys were the IRAA and Disney, and which goes back into the 60s. These copyright battles, the way that copyright functions has always been to serve large corporations. It hasn't been about protecting independent artists at any point in history. But it's just like it's this dual-sided blade, right? Like it's a pharmacon in a lot of ways, where a lot of what I study and I'm interested in are shadow libraries, these collections of pirated, scanned, illegitimate materials. I've been researching for years things like LibGen. I won't name all the rest.
LibGen's the GOAT, of course.
Yeah. If you know, right? Like so, like these shadow libraries, Joe Karanganis and others have theorized that are. And Gail DeKosnik recently, I know, is doing research on this as well, are absolutely essential to students who don't have access to the same kind of knowledge infrastructures surrounded by books here at UCLA that I have, right? Particular folks from the Global South who want to access scientific papers, research, literature. The shadow libraries have afforded access to knowledge in ways that I think are politically vibrant and important and liberatory. And at the same time, this is the pharmacological, where like if that's the cure, the poison that comes alongside it is that these same shadow libraries have amassed the millions of books that have fed the corpuses of the large language models which are run by tech oligarchs to fuel a new system of techno-feudalism where we're on track to see our first trillionaire in a couple of years. So one way that I found really useful for thinking about this incredibly vexed situation has been what Patrick Jagoda calls network ambivalence. This idea that to study something like the internet, you have to hold the manifold horrors of these platforms right alongside the deep and meaningful joys or surprises or delights that they hold as well. So thinking about something like Reddit, obviously fueled by hate and misogyny and racism in so many corners, but at the same time, a space for political activism and organizing, for community formations, for reconciliations with one's gender identity, right? Like any number of joyful, meaningful encounters are facilitated by that same platform. And so I think when addressing these ongoing trends in technology and in technology studies or trying to wrap our minds around things like large language models requires a healthy dose of network ambivalence. Or I think the more common version, this is Haraway, staying with the trouble, that one can't outright critique these systems and negate them altogether. I mean, you can, like you can advocate for burning down the internet. That's fine by me. But you can't just like wholeheartedly embrace them either, because that just adds to this boosterish discourse that's unaware of the real harms that these systems produce. And so by staying with the trouble, I think it requires one to continuously work to disentangle the one from the other and to try to be clear-sighted enough to recognize the differences wherever they might emerge.
Well, it strikes me, I mean, this is very in keeping with, you know, what I know of you and your personality, but you're talking about incredibly troubling things, but you're bringing this like playful approach to it. Does it feel, yeah, talk to me about where like play fits into how you're thinking about this and more broadly, maybe topics in Little Database.
Yeah, I like this question about play quite a bit. If I pause for a moment, it's because I'm being transported back to my upbringing in rural Utah, where I was raised Mormon in a fully eschatological imaginary that the world was going to end at literally any moment, that Jesus was going to come back, 1,000 years of judgment. I think I read a book about Hiroshima when I was like way too young. And so for about a year, my parents told me when I was quite young, any time that the sun was setting, I was convinced it was an atomic bomb and the world was over. So like I think that there is there's an intimacy with the end of the world that I think I've grown up with. I've written about this in a book called Apocalypse Reliquary, which is a comic book that is a kind of like fictitious museum that preserves an object from each time the world is destroyed. So the world is destroyed over and over and over again. I did a lot of research for like every prophecy of the end of the world, ranging from like Koresh up to like say like 16 million angels will descend on the planet in spaceships. And then imagine them as though they all really happen. So the world is just destroyed over and over and over again. To try to like, I don't know exactly what I'm trying to do with that, but it was trying to like access, I think, an affect of feeling like the world is ending and what one can do, which I think is a feeling that we are all contending with pretty consistently. It's why it's so nice for me to listen to Urgent Futures, because I feel like it like taps me into that feeling where it's like, okay, like people are real, like they're talking about the end of the world, and this is really happening in a way that like I was kind of trained to imagine would happen in a religious register from my early youth. No longer my imaginary, but at the time it was. And so I think that like that living with the idea of the end of the world has led to a kind of like Pollyanna-ish perspective on these horrors. Like I've always loved like the figure of like the anarchist with a bomb in his pocket. Like I think that there's a kind of like there should be a kind of like pleasure and a joy to the work that we do, because we don't get to be here for very long, you know. And I think like there is like a great deal of play in all of the work that I'm doing, and I think we could put this in the framework of like serious play or critical play in Mary Flanagan's terms, where play is able to like test the rules of various kinds of situation, test the rules of different types of systems and genres. But it's also, I think, like an important part of just like being a human being on the planet, and trying to figure out a way to work on these subjects and continue to linger with them, to stay with those troubles in a way that doesn't kill you, that doesn't drive you into a deep depression, that tries to think about possibilities outward. In my recent research, I've really turned toward video games, I think, for this reason. There's a book that I love by Chris Patterson called Open World Empire, that makes this really compelling and beautiful argument about the world political system being kind of like an open world video game,
Mm.
where like you can't, like, if you're playing an open world video game, you can't, like, I mean, you could shut it off, but then you're not playing the game anymore. But if you're in the game, if you're in the open world, like our open world empire, he says that the best you can hope to do is just like, basically, I forget exactly how he says this, but it's basically like you can be really, really naughty. Like you can just like, you can like play the rules poorly. You can experiment with what the physics of this world are going to allow. You can try to subvert and upend the economics of the virtual game that you're playing. That like games are ways and spaces for modeling um, other worlds and other ways of being in the world. So if I've been working for a long time on this little database project, and trying to like play these databases, play through the contents of these databases to surface latent potentials or hidden meanings, or new ways of understanding the world, I feel like there's been a kind of natural progression from that type of approach to network culture and cultural memory objects, that's led directly into what I've been doing recently around speculative games, and trying to really think about uh, how our relationship to knowledge has transformed. And maybe video games is an unlikely place to do that, but that's what I've been thinking about.
That's amazing. I mean, can you say more about what, I mean, we talked about Death Stranding earlier,
Mm.
but like as you're researching and conducting serious play, um, and definitely not sitting on your couch snacking as well while you do it, God
No,
forbid.
no.
What are you finding in yourself? Like thinking kind of back to your, doomsday childhood
Mm.
and the way that play created an avenue through now playing games at this moment of eschatological urgency,
Mm.
and kind of bringing all the research from Little Database into whatever mystery thing is coming next related to games. Like,
Mm.
how are you feeling? What are you encountering? Like, put me in that head and heart space.
Oh, that's such a lovely question. Yeah, I feel like it's funny because I love artworks that resist immersion, and yet I love games that are fully immersive. Like I love to be, a character traversing a barren landscape in an open world video game. And I think a lot of that has to do with affect, and play in these kinds of simulated spaces produces these kinds of emotions that I'm looking for. And I think I'm often looking for this kind of like yeah, like science fictional or speculative extrapolation that makes me, as all sci-fi, as Jameson and others have said, as all sci-fi does, that reflects on the present in a new way by like extrapolating from where we are to bring us to somewhere weird, but that weird place isn't actually like taking us away from where we are. It just allows us to see where we are differently in a new light, and what Jameson calls that desire called utopia, right? To like look for some answer to the political systems we find ourselves in. So yeah, when I'm playing games, I'm often thinking about that quite a bit. I've been thinking a lot about, I guess, like my relationship to the internet and to knowledge. I think as a scholar and an academic, when I'm playing games, I'm also like playing as a scholar and an academic. So I love like Elden Ring, for example, like going and finding specific objects so I could read their lore entries, which is like the dorkiest thing in the world. Like playing a video game like Elden Ring or Control, I do this a lot. Where in Control, you're in this kind of it's like a supernatural FBI that's been possessed by this demonic force. Incidentally, the demonic force is chanting a Dadaist poem. They're like hovering over you and they're chanting Dadaist poetry. So it's kind of like this game was built for me. But within it, there's all these redacted documents. And so, like, if the game is wanting me to like go around and shoot these demons, I find myself drawn to like going and finding documents and reading documents in these spaces. Like, there's something about that that's really thrilling to me. I think that's the same thrill of scholarship from the very beginning. The idea of like finding this like rare document and trying to make sense of that document as a way to understand this bizarre world that I find myself in. So that's, I think, the prevailing feeling I've been looking for. And I think increasingly I've been trying to like get to this feeling that we were just talking, like this like large language model feeling, right? Like it is destroying the world. It is happening in ways that we have a really hard time understanding. And so I've been looking to games to try and help me understand a little bit better what that feels like and what kind of possibilities there are. Can I give one final game anecdote? So I've been obsessively thinking about and writing about Baldur's Gate 3 recently. For those who don't know, it's a D&D based game, and Firunts won the Guinness Book of World Record for the most words in the video game. Like, its script has 2 million lines of dialogue. It's this huge, immersive, it's like the desktops and dungeons, like imaginary par excellence, where you can go into this world and like live among the characters and play out your D&D fantasy. But recently, there's a modder who produced a neural interface within the diegetics of the game world. It's like a tadpole in your brain, but this tadpole allows you to like talk to your characters using your like natural language controller. So you can be playing D&D, which already has the biggest script of any game ever, and he's connected it to a large language model, of course. So this tadpole in your brain is actually a large language model that connects to your other characters, so you can just have conversations with them. And doing it was so uncanny and so bizarre in the game, like having emotional conversations with these characters about, like, I don't know, what I was snacking on the couch while I was doing my research. As like a new and emerging aesthetic form, I feel like it was doing certain things aesthetically and poetically that I'd never seen a book do, and that I'd never seen a film do. And so I think a lot of my research has increasingly turned to emerging genres. That's why I think I spend a lot of time looking at comic books and video games and internet art, because the forms of experiment that they produce are just, I think they're just doing new things that, like, genres can get really, I think, stultified. Like, a poem does certain kinds of things. We know what it looks like on the page. It's typically lineated. It occasionally has rhymes, whatever. Like, you know a poem when you see it. And a lot of the video games I'm playing recently, like, I don't know what the hell I'm looking at until I've been in there for a couple of hours. And I think it's that potential for form to signify that keeps me looking at new forms and trying to find, you asked about feelings, like, what am I feeling in there? I think it's like the wonder of, like, how many forms and aesthetic modes there are for understanding the world around us, that they're not limited to these things that museums contain or that our shelves contain, but they're like actually like expansive and grow in response to the writing tools and technologies that surround us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it was beautiful.
Yeah. Okay.
Beautiful. I guess tying together the previous two threads, you're talking about this Baldur's Gate mod. I'm wondering what your sense or like finger to the wind is with the intersection of games and AI.
Oh God.
Just in the sense that,
Pharmacons, they're all pharmacons.
They're all pharmacons, which I think you said this, but just to state it, is like something you take that is the poison and the cure.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm seeing a lot of, I am seeing a lot of discourse, and it's actually coming from like film TV folks around like programmatic media. Like, you can make your own Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm.
And while I understand that as a fan fiction, like, I understand how that will be popular as a form of fan fiction, but I don't watch Game of Thrones to have my own Game of Thrones. No. I watch Game of Thrones to have the like tyrannically canonical version of Game of Thrones that we all watch, so that we can talk about it and kind of share in it. And I'm sure, even though I'm sort of disconnected from the games community, that there are like similar conversations and skirmishes breaking out around like endless programmatic interactivity and play versus the kind of like on rails proverbially speaking on rails version of the video game, even if it is a wide open world game. So yeah, what are you sensing, feeling kind of in that? And are there any like key, I don't know, flashpoints worth mentioning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It helps me to this whole conversation. So I feel like I need to go home and like take notes.
I said a really great thing.
No, you provoked so many good ideas. So, I think that this is a problem. I think the Game of Thrones example is really good. Like, I think it's a limitation of the imaginary that like, I mean, that's not, yeah, it's not, you turn to Game of Thrones for like, well, I mean, I was going to say like a tightly scripted human written narrative, but that's not Game of Thrones.
Right,
But,
right.
you turn to like film or like these types of narratives to have something that humans are still really, really good at. Like, you don't need an AI to give you a Game of Thrones, right? Like, I think that's to like fully misunderstand what the technologies can and can't do, and why they might be interesting. Of course, there are, I think in the field, there are these procedurally generated world games. No Man's Sky is probably like the prime example. And I know they're developing a new game along those lines. There are the idea of these like endlessly procedurally generated game worlds, but that sounds really boring to me. Like I turn to games to have these like crazy sci-fi experiences. I like documents that are written that have something interesting to say, where you get AI slop in a game. You already can barely trust a fetch quest is going to be worthwhile. Like usually they're not. Like usually it's just kind of filler anyway. But an AI generated slop filler is just like, oh, the
Death Stranding
worst.
3.
Oh
Death
my
Stranding
God.
3.
I think the Alter has gotten into a lot of trouble for this, where they were
Mm.
found to be AI generating a lot of their in-game text, and the community was rightly, I think, they felt cheated by it. And so I think it's like the wrong thing. I turned to Death Stranding. Part of why I found Death Stranding interesting, fully made by humans, not an AI game, but has this really interesting theory of quantum computing in this world that's haunted by these like supernatural entities, post-apocalyptic world. As you're connecting people to this quantum internet, you're also empowering them to print objects onto the environment. So this like quantum internet is so powerful. Its data is so strong that you could like, if you have the right materials, you could print a street into the environment, or you can print a zip line or a car, whatever. And other players who are playing the game will also encounter those things that you've built. So it's this kind of like emergent, weird, ghostly collaboration you're having with a bunch of other people playing game. Like that as a structure is wild. I've never seen anything like it. But it led me to think about some of the things I was doing during COVID, which was playing tabletop role-playing games with my friends in VR. And we talked about VR before. Playing these games in VR and having the capacity in VR, typically with tabletop role-playing games, you're sitting around a table, it's like Dungeons and Dragons, and you're rolling dice and you're telling stories, and you're all kind of sharing the same like imaginary story world. Like you're in Faerun and you're a dwarf and I'm an elf and whatever. But when you're in VR, like you are a dwarf and I can be an elf. And then if I say like, oh, if I'm like GMing a session, like, oh, and we like walked past this river, then like, at least in COVID, I could search what was then Google Poly, which is a great like, set of 3D assets that's now defunct. And I could just like print a river into our shared VR space. Now that felt like magic. It was like, oh, I'm summoning this thing. We're doing what humans do really well. We're like telling stories and we're having an adventure and we're like imagining like, oh, and there's a castle. So I'd search Google Poly and there'd be a castle that wasn't what I was imagining, but it was like good enough. It was like the castle I saw. So I would like bring it into the space and then make it huge. And it just like, it felt like there was some kind of really empowering way that I could connect with my dear friends from across the country that felt like meaningful. And it wasn't, AI wasn't writing the narrative. Like, AI wasn't even involved at all. But I could imagine if I was like in a VR space, and I know that you can do this now with Meshi and a number of other apps where you can like prompt something into existence. So instead of like the weird malformed castle I had, I could say like a Gothic castle that like has like X, Y, and Z parameters, and that could be printed into the space. Now, here, I think this is where it's really important to distinguish like human forms of creativity and meaning making, right? Like this is a poetics question. Like that castle has meaning to me because I had imagined it in this shared narrative that I was building with my other friends. It wouldn't be meaningful to me if I just like walked up to a castle that an AI had generated outside of that context. So again, I feel like it's like this like site-specific modality, and that's just one example where I can imagine an AI system that enriched my experience of play. And I use the word play just as a synonym for having a meaningful and joyful connection to another human being.
Amazing. I feel like that's the right place to move on to my recurring questions. But before I do, I want to make sure there's obviously so much in the little database. It's an incredible book. Go buy it right now. And so I'm not trying to have you do a laundry list of every single thing that's in the book, but is there anything that we missed that you'd maybe feel like is worth calling out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird book. I hope it's useful. I really dedicated it and wrote it toward futures of use. I think, one of the things I didn't mention is like all these websites I'm writing about. I maybe mention this offhand. I've been working on building for years, like since 2004. I've been scanning old books, breaking poetry recordings into individual MP3 files, securing and finding and posting and ripping video content. Like I've been helping to build these collections, and I've always built them under this like idea of like some future of use. Like I'm putting this file up so that some other kid, maybe from rural Utah, can encounter something that is world opening and opens up possibilities. And so in that same kind of gesture of like digitizing and hosting and making these things public to open up the possibilities for other forms of use, I would say like, the book is really offered as not like a set of answers to programmatically understand whatever, even the title, what a little database is. I don't know if I had to do so many acrobatics just to get to it in the beginning of our conversation. But it's an invitation to play for other people to use methods to maybe get out of some of the, especially in academe, strictures of academic convention that might open up other ways of seeing the world or other ways of playing and encountering these types of materials. I think that's probably good.
Well, I realized as you said that I lied. I have another question.
Oh.
You made the digital, or you made a digital version of the book open access. There is an ebook as well that folks can buy, but there's also an open access version. We talked about shadow libraries and the role that shadow libraries play in disseminating knowledge. Talk me through your decision making of why it was so important, because you really had to go to pains to make sure that you had an open access version to the book. And it's not something that obviously any press is going to be super thrilled to hear when they're, trying to sell a book. So talk to me about the decision-making process there and like why that was such an important part of the offering.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I mean, it does follow on what I was just saying about, forms of use and being able to open things up. Like it was always in my mind a book that contained a film and an audio track and this other book and this other book and this third book. And there's actually like an entire text corpus as well as a Python script. Like there's lots of things that are in it.
It's its own little database.
It's its own little data. Yes. And I make that argument a number of points that like even an essay can be a kind of little database. And I think that was important from the beginning to say like, not just are there these other methods or other ways of doing scholarship in a traditional sense, but that the video is like knowledge building in the same way that the chapter is and is part of the book. It's not like this external thing. I think this happens pretty often when scholars are like auto theorizing their works. They'll like talk about this artwork they did, but it's only like in the chapter. Like the artwork itself like doesn't count. Like it doesn't count as scholarship, as knowledge building. And I wanted to push back on that. Like I wanted the book to say like these other modes of production are also meaningful and are doing scholarship. They are producing knowledge in ways that I find really important. So I wanted the book to have that, both to offer permission for other scholars, but for my own self also, as I'm navigating the credentialing system of the university. All the creative work I did didn't. I mean, I shouldn't say it's too loud here, but it didn't matter very much, right? Like it really, like they needed the book and they need the peer-reviewed articles. And so I think, as a kind of like scholarly activism, we have to kind of open up those doors a bit more if we want to see this work emerge, which I really do. I was shocked actually that the press allowed me to keep in the sentence where the whole book is about specificity and contingency. And so I have to spell out like, the book is going to read really differently based on how you encounter it. Like that's been one of my core arguments. Like the book, I should be aware of that. Like if it's a paper book, the images are in black and white, and you know what? The links don't work. Like you can't touch them with your finger, and they don't open anything up, right? Like I'm making a lot of networked arguments. I link to a number of different works on the internet, or have like sound files in my sound chapter. So that's one version. The ebook has color images and links out and like has all the affordances of whatever ebook reader you're using. I wrote, and I was shocked that they let me keep this in, that like hopefully the reader finds it on like a rogue archive in Gail DeCoe's term, like on one of these shadow libraries as this kind of like illicit PDF, which I should say for the record, I will not be seeding. But maybe it will be out there. I mean, it's quite likely most books on this catalog are immediately on the internet after they're released. And the open access version was really important. So I had to apply for grants at the university, who generously sponsored the open access version, so that the films and the audio works and these books, as well as the Python script, could live inside the publication, not as some kind of like indexical paratext. And maybe this is some good concluding lines, where a lot of the whole project was to try to resist the indexical impulse to say, whatever I'm seeing on my screen isn't the real thing. Like the real thing's out there somewhere, right? Like when we see films on YouTube or listen to MP3 files of readings, like, we typically kind of like project to some like historical past, which we may never encounter. Like it's not likely that many people are going to see the films I discuss in celluloid anytime soon. I doubt I will see a lot of the works I discuss in their real analog instantiations ever. And so to reject the indexical impulse to kind of point to some other thing and to take seriously the digital objects as the things themselves that have their own meaning-making systems. And so the open access version is one way to try to value those digital objects and include them in the book. It's an inclusive thing.
Amazing. On that note, I have 3 recurring questions that I ask all my guests.
Let's go.
You know the drill. What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I want to say poetry, but I really also don't.
Well, say, how about this? Sub-question. Why poetry, and then why not?
I do wish people paid more attention and I think attended with care to form. And I think that ranges from the level of discourse in the world to go jump on scales, right, to the like infrastructural capacities of our fragile planet that we are all living within, that is rapidly being extracted, but that these the ability to see form, whether that's on the level of like infrastructure or on the minute detail of like, poetic prosody, I do wish people saw form and attended to the forms they use with care and with invention.
Amazing. Did you want to, like, when you said you did, but you didn't, did you want to speak to the other half of like what resistance you were feeling?
Well, I mean, to be sincere, Jesse, I think it has to do with maybe like common conceptions of poetry. So when I say like, yes, I want people to like see poetry and attend with care to form. Like I'm very informed by like these like experimental outliers that like each of which kind of like expands my brain. Like I feel like I turned to poetry for experiment because it was like a place where like language was made strange or ostrenyi in Russian, the idea that like, the role of art is to make the everyday strange. Unfortunately, I think the vast majority of poetry doesn't do that. Like the vast majority of poetry makes me kind of sad. And I think it makes me sad, not from the intentions of the authors, which I wholeheartedly support. And I absolutely, want to encourage a robust poetry reading public. But they make me sad because they don't open up my mind. Like they feel closed. And so I think I sometimes lean on poetry and poetics, or at least in my head, it means experiment. And I know that doesn't mean that for most people. And so, I think, we can bridge those things, because if on the first hand, like the pro poetry, I was saying attend with care to form. And on the no to poetry, it's like produce, experiment, and play. I think like those two things can meet in the middle, where poetry and poetics is a place for me for experiment and play that is carefully attuned to the forms it inhabits.
I love that. And as you know from past conversations, completely agree.
Yes.
Yes. What is one resource you would recommend for making better sense of reality?
I mean, beyond this podcast, I don't know. I'm
Not allowed.
I'm very plugged into this podcast. I think one other resource for making sense of this reality I should plug, in any kind of academic book like this one, like you have a limited, even though I've expanded this, I'm really trying to explode this form in a lot of ways. I can only explode into so many different directions. And so one of the last things I did was compile a set of little databases that I didn't get to discuss in the book. Things like Vim's Lair, which is this amazing collection of retro video games, or Jason Scott's amazing text files, which collects like old forms of ASCII art from the demo scene. It's an amazing resource. And there's too many to name. The Queer Zines online project, the Cyber Feminist Index, Rhizome's archive, like all of these collections and all of this really, I think, delicate and important work of care and maintenance to preserve and make available cultural memories in small, roguish, independent, weird ways. I think that these collections have been, both as I've said, the site of my production for the last 20 years, but they've also been the site of my education, like an education that I think the little databases that I'm informed by have informed me more than my classrooms ever did. And so I will just say, if you go to the centerfold of the Language Does Not Equals magazine, I've got a batch of like at least 40 cool little databases that I can almost guarantee will have something new for any listener.
Amazing. And what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
I'm going to answer that question a little bit in the inverse.
Okay.
Rather than like a moment in which my sense of reality was disrupted. I like this. I mean, I love this question. I love where this goes. But for me, I think what I've been trying to discuss or what I'm advocating for in this approach to experimentalism, games and literature, play and contingency, both in this book and in my work beyond it, is that like, I think that's why I turned to art and literature to begin with. Like that if a work doesn't have a moment where my sense of the world is in some way disrupted or some way transformed, then that's not a work I like very much. And so I feel like I'm like a junkie for like having a sense, or like this is why I turn to these things. Like I turn to these things for this feeling that oh, like I thought I understood how language worked, but this gives me a new dimension. Or I thought I understood like this aspect of how large language models function, but here's a work that reveals this whole other dimension I've missed. And sometimes that's a horrifying disruption where I've learned, my partner, the AI scholar Mashinka Hakopian, has this great way of saying, we have a repartee where we say like, how are things going? Are they as bad as we thought? Are they worse? And it's always like they're worse than we thought. and like that disruption too, like is a way of knowing the world around us. Like even if that disruption is the recognition that the world is just like slightly worse or that it's slightly better. I feel like that's a feeling that I try to chase. And one that I get on this podcast all the time.
No Urgent Futures answers allowed. Those are all amazing responses. And this whole conversation has been really, really lovely.
Thank you so much for having me. Jesse, there are a few people that I enjoy talking to more, and this is such a generous conversation, as it always is. If there's anyone who tends with care to form, it's you throughout each of these episodes. I'm really just honored to be here.
Oh, thank you. I'm so honored to have you. Final bit. Anything related to Little Database or future projects that people should be aware of, and where can people find you just generally?
Oh, I feel like I've spoken about the Little Database more than I had ever hoped to. So you can find it at the University of Minnesota Press. I will say the open access version is kind of hard to find. It's a small link at the bottom of the page.
A little link. But it's free and open, and that was very important to me. So feel free to access and explore the book, hopefully for some future use of yours. I'm easy to find. I think if you Google my name, you'll end up on my website. And I try to stay off of social media as much as I can, but that's a professional hazard. Indeed. All right. Well, Danny, thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Jesse.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.